So hello, welcome to session 2 of the Foundation for Science and Technology Foundation for Future Leaders Conference. So I'm Dr. Sandy Knowles from the University of Birmingham, where I'm a materials engineer leading a research group working towards energy applications. So it's the interest in this session. And I'm one of the current cohort of Foundation for Future Leaders for the Foundation for Science and Technology. So I'm delighted to chair this session on is net zero by 2050 or earlier reasonable? So now in the wake of the Glasgow Global Climate Conference, COP26, we have seen like the newfound commitments to decarbonize, but I think it leaves us with no illusions quite the scale of the challenge. So here in the UK, we've seen the commitments to reaching net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. So we want to be discussing during this session, is this goal reasonable? And what it's going to take to make that happen. So we have two speakers who are each going to be talking for 20-25 minutes each. And that gives us a nice time for an extended question and answer session from 12:30 to 1. So in the meantime, can you please, like during the talks, please put questions into the Q&A and upvote, make comments. It's very useful to kind of us to prioritize what questions to answer. And also a note that this session is being recorded and will go up onto the Foundation of Science and Technology website probably later today or tomorrow. So to introduce our first speaker, this is Baroness Brown of Cambridge, Professor Dame Julia King, who is an engineer and crossbench member of the House of Lords with extensive experience in industry and academia. I was very interested to see kind of some of our common early backgrounds working in metals and metallurgy and some fantastic early parts of her career, both in academia and industry, and then going into the world of policy and some fantastic impact had there. So Julia was vice chair of the Climate Change Committee for 12 years and continues to advise the UK government as chair of the Adaptation Committee of the CCC and as a member of the Hydrogen Advisory Council. She chairs the Carbon Trust and is a non-executive director of the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. She was previously a non-executive director at the Green Investment Bank, and she led the King Review on decarbonising transport in 2006-07 for the Chancellor Executive, and is the sector champion for the offshore wind sector deal and part of the government's industrial strategy. So Baroness Brown, delighted to have you here. Please take it over.
Thank you very much, Sandy. So let me get going by sharing my slides. Right, well, I want to talk about both about is net zero achievable, but is net zero enough? And by that, I don't mean do we need to go beyond net zero. It would be great if we could, but I think we're going to be challenged enough to get to net zero. But actually, just to remind everyone that net zero implies considerable additional change to the climate, and it will be absolutely crucial that we also adapt. Just let me start by reminding us all that the climate is changing. And here is my favorite data set. It's my favorite data set because I think it's absolutely amazing that they have been recording the date of full flowering cherry blossom day in Kyoto since the early 800s. And it's been hovering around a similar date for hundreds and hundreds of years until the early 1900s, when it started getting earlier, and it is now 15 to 20 days earlier than it has been since the early 800s. So clearly a very interesting set of data, which tells you something very interesting about human behavior, I think. But this is perhaps a more useful way of looking at is the climate changing? And we can see since the early 1900s, we've seen a continuous rise in temperature. So that's that same data set. And I now just want to look at what it will look like if we are globally on a path to net zero and hopefully to below 2 degrees of warming, hopefully below that, but let's assume it's around 2 degrees of warming. So this is what the future could look like. This is one of a set of predictions from the Met Office. And what I want you to keep in your minds is that we've just had the hottest 10 years on record, But temperature doesn't start to stabilize till we get to net zero. And so the next 30 years will each be the hottest 10 years on record. So we have a lot of warming to come, even on a net zero pathway. And I think the last year really has felt like the world was trying to send leaders at COP26 a message with that appalling flooding in Germany and Belgium, which could so easily have happened here. That weather system could have been over us. At some point in the future, it's very likely that weather system will be over us, and we will see devastation of that sort. But of course, we've seen devastation, climate-induced devastation, and extraordinary, unprecedented things happening all around the world. Just in 2021 alone. And the cost of the damage, the human cost is of course increasing, but the insurance cost is also increasing. And this data suggests that climate-related events have increased in terms of financial impact from something like $357 billion in the decade of the 1980s to something like 1.5 trillion in the last decade. So that's going to go on rising at least that pace, if not more, over the next 30 years. So what are we doing about it in the UK? Well, we have made a commitment to get to net zero by 2050, and we made that in 2019. So here's our starting point in 2019. And we can see that the only sector that looks as if it has any chance of getting to net zero at the moment is the power sector. And that dramatic reduction in power sector emissions has come from taking coal off the system. So we've got to replace that coal and grow the power system with lots of renewables. But we've got some really problematic areas like transport and buildings, which run through the center of that plot, the blue and the orange lines. And we've got some other problems like aviation, which is the bluey grey line at the bottom, which is increasing and just crossing over the green line at the end. So a lot more to do across every sector of the economy. And this in the Climate Change Committee's modelling shows the types of things we need to be doing and the sort of contribution they could make to us reaching net zero in 2050. So the purpley colours are reduced demand and improved efficiency, including resource efficiency. The orange, red and yellow are take up of new technologies, in particular a huge role for electrification, but also hydrogen and carbon capture. The blue is the expansion of the zero carbon electricity system to accommodate all of that electrification. And that still leaves us with some emissions. So we're going to need some offsetting, which is why, of course, it's net zero. Hopefully, as much of that offsetting as possible can be through nature-based solutions, but we may need some direct air capture or other sorts of removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Underlying that are huge changes to the way we use energy. So in the core scenario that the Climate Change Committee used for the 6th carbon budget, electricity use more than doubles. So electricity use today is about 300 terawatt hours. By 2050, that's gone up to 720 terawatt hours. So almost 2.5 times as big. In some scenarios, it goes up to 3 times as much electricity. So we need to see a huge expansion in our electricity system. But it's also simplistically a very dramatic change in the way we use energy. So today we use about 2,000 terawatt hours of energy in total. And actually electricity is only about 15% of that. The rest is oil and gas. In 2050, we will be much, much more efficient because, for example, an electric vehicle is something like 4 times more efficient than an internal combustion engine. So our energy use in total drops quite dramatically, but most of it will be electricity. So we'll be essentially an electric nation. And that brings with it issues of resilience. Our electricity system is going to have to be hugely resilient to things like the changing climate, because when the electricity goes off, then everything will stop. The scale of the change, as we've just heard, is very significant indeed. And I think this is my list that just reminds us the sort of scale of things we have to do in the next 30 years. We've got to more than double the size of the electricity system. We've got to grow offshore wind from 10 gigawatts today to nearly 100 gigawatts by 2050. We've got to support that by transforming the grid, because we could be into 80+% variable renewables by 2050. So the grid's got to grow in scale, but it's got to grow enormously in terms of flexibility and storage and resilience. We've got to grow a green hydrogen industry, or a green and blue hydrogen industry, essentially from nothing today to something approaching the size of our current electricity system. We've got to get carbon capture and storage up and running. We've got 29 million buildings that need to be converted to low carbon heat. We've got to get to something of the order of 35 million zero carbon vehicles and the infrastructure to support them. We've got to get afforestation and woodland creation from below 10,000 hectares per annum to around 50,000 hectares per annum, increasing our woodland and forest cover by about 4% to about 18%, still one of the lowest in Europe, if not the lowest in Europe. That will need major changes to agriculture and significant changes to our diets. So we've done things of that scale in 30 years before. It's not really clear that we've ever managed to do all of those things at once, but all of those things are doable. With the right commitment, none of those things are impossible. So it is doable, but it's going to take a lot of commitment and a lot of mobilization of the population. And that's, I think, one of the most challenging bits. If we look at where we've come to since the Climate Change Act was passed, then 83% of the emissions reduction since the Climate Change Act was passed have come essentially from things like decarbonizing industry and in a major chunk from decarbonizing the electricity system. So things that haven't involved you or I having to do anything different at all. You switch the light switch, the same electricity, the same lights come on. We haven't actually had to engage with that in any real way. As we move forward to 2050, we find that something like 60% of what we need to do actually needs people to be engaged with it. People in their homes, in their choices of car, in their behaviors need to be making different decisions. So a significant majority of what we need to do going forward needs the public to be fully engaged. But there is some good news as well, which is that it's getting cheaper. I think Nick Stern said it might cost us 3% to decarbonize. In the CCC's first work that we did for the Climate Change Act back in 2008, we thought it was going to cost between 1% and 2% to get to an 80% reduction. The core scenario now suggests that we should get to, we might get to 100% reduction at 0.5% of GDP, 0.5% of GDP. And indeed, some of the other analysis that's been done in places like Oxford and others is now suggesting actually that we will increase GDP by decarbonising the UK economy. So actually, the amazing reductions in costs we've seen in solar and batteries, in offshore wind, are actually driving the costs of the transition down and actually driving the economic opportunities from the transition up. So actually, it looks like an entirely economically rational thing to do, even without taking into account the costs of the climate damage. So it's kind of win-win-win. But let me just get back to that point that net zero is not enough. Actually, just sorting out the emissions doesn't keep people safe. Climate risk is a combination of the hazard caused by the emissions, how exposed people are to it, and how vulnerable people are to it. And adaptation is about reducing exposure and vulnerability. So here we are, it's been getting very, very much hotter. And down in the southeast, maximum temperatures are rising at almost a degree per decade. We're going to see growing water deficits, again, particularly down in the southeast. We're growing, even on a 2-degree path, we're going to see more people at risk of flooding. We're already seeing in Europe the impact of climate change on our forests. In Germany, they're seeing huge impacts of winter rainfall, summer drought and heat, new pests and diseases already hitting most of their common trees. And this is the kind of issue that we are going to be seeing from climate change. And by the 2050s, quite a lot more climate change, as I showed in those earlier charts, is going to happen. So another 0.6 or so degrees of temperature rise is likely. We're going to see less summer rainfall. We're going to see more winter rainfall. We're going to see more of that rainfall coming as bursts of very, very heavy rainfall, which cause surface water flooding. We're going to see our heat wave summers like 2018 will just be a normal summer by the middle of the century, and the sea level is going to be continuing to rise. So we've got to be prepared for all of that, even if we are on, as we all hope we will be, the net zero pathway. So we've got to start making sure that when we convert buildings and build new homes, they are safe for people to live in. Unlike this office block converted to flats, where in the summer of 2018, in the unshaded rooms, internal temperatures reached almost 50 degrees. Somebody with asthma, an elderly person not very mobile, a baby in a cot could have been killed by those sorts of internal temperatures. It's not acceptable that we are providing homes for people that are not safe in the context of our changing climate. We've got to think about how we support nature to adapt to the climate. And part of that is thinking about what trees do we plant in this forest and woodland, in these forests and woodlands we need to generate. And you can see the dramatic change in the suitability for growing beech trees. So around me in Cambridge, we shouldn't be planting beech hedges in our gardens because by 2050, they are really going to struggle. And similarly, Sitka spruce. So lots of these lovely trees will be moving up to Scotland, and we should be thinking about some more Mediterranean planting for the long term in regions in the southeast. Adaptation can work. This is how we could transform the picture in terms of water availability if we move from 140 litres per person per day water consumption down to down to about 90. And if industry makes the same kinds of savings, and if we address all of the leaks in our water system, then we could get to 2050 with very similar water availability that we have today. So adaptation action can really make a difference. And we need to be building new homes in areas like Cambridgeshire, where I am, where we are in a water stressed area. We need to be building them to much, much higher water efficiency standards, so that we don't end up with the picture on the left, we end up with the picture on the right. And we need to stop building we need to stop locking in problems for the future, for example, by building in areas of high flood risk. And this just shows you in the last 25 years or so, quite how much building work has continued to go on in areas we know are at increasing flood risk in the future. And finally, we need to recognize that climate change disproportionately impacts the vulnerable. So if we think about coastal communities, we have many areas of poverty around our coastal communities, and also many elderly people live in our coastal communities. So these are people who suffer from vulnerability and inequality in terms of both age and low income. If they're in coastal communities, then of course they're particularly susceptible to coastal flooding. As we've said, they have greater vulnerability. They're more likely to live in uninsured homes. And so when that climate hazard impacts them, they suffer disproportionate losses. So uninsured homes, so they lose assets. If they're having to do all their own cleaning up, they may have to take more time off work. We know from data from the 2007 floods that people from low-income groups are 8 times more likely to report mental health problems as a result of flooding. So all of these things mean that vulnerable groups suffer disproportionately in terms of climate change and therefore become more vulnerable. So it becomes a negative spiral. And we see that in the UK. And of course, we see that internationally as well, with the countries that are already having to deal with significant climate change impacts. So it's absolutely crucial that when we think about dealing with climate change, we think about dealing with inequality at the same time. And one of the things we critically need to do is to make sure we integrate, or rather we test, just about all policy that we produce in the UK, both against, does it stack up with net zero, but also does it include consideration of adaptation? And we've had quite a lot of relevant, what should have been relevant announcements that deal with, for example, net zero, things like the Green Homes Grant, where no mention was made of preparing our homes for the future. So you can be doing all sorts of work on the inside of your home to put in the insulation and the heat pump. But while you're doing that, that's the time to be putting in the shading and making sure that home is livable in even hotter summers. But the piece of policy only dealt with the reducing emissions. We've had the net zero strategy now that does at least mention adaptation, but it isn't particularly well integrated. And of course, we have some policy that's mainly focused on adaptation, things like the flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy. But we're still seeing far too much policy which doesn't take both net zero and adaptation into account. And we really need to get that thinking across government to make sure that both these aspects of reducing climate change impacts are taken into account in all of the policy that we produce. So thank you very much for listening to you. I just leave you with a quote from Greta Thunberg, which is this brilliant one about cathedral thinking, which is we've got to get started. We don't have to know exactly all of the technologies that we might be able to use in 2050. We know enough about it in order to get going. And it is absolutely urgent that we make really significant strides over the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
Really fascinating, Peter, both the challenges we face and actually how the kind of mechanisms of government can help us get there. So really, thank you very much, Baroness Brown. That was really fantastic. So I think we're going to save question and answers until the end of the session. So if people can start throwing in questions, I've already got quite a few that I'm going to have to hold on to for now. So I'm glad then to introduce our second speaker. So Dr. Douglas Parr is Policy Director at Greenpeace UK. He has specialised in climate change policy across power, heat and transport sectors for many years and all aspects of the social and economic transition. He also monitors developments in issues such as bioenergy, agriculture and land use, and has previously worked on a number of issues, including chemicals policy, green refrigeration, waste and marine conservation. So Doug, over to you. I don't know if slides are working okay, we can swap over.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Julia, for that intro. I'm going to try and share my screen now.
Great, coming through.
It's coming through. Excellent. Here we go from the beginning. Okay, so I'm going to take a slightly more kind of, well, both global and sort of schematic view of what's going on. A little bit more politics perhaps than Julia's presentation. And that's partly driven by reflecting on what happened up at COP26 and what it means for what we need to do going forward. So yeah, COP26, obviously one of the most important things that's happened since the Paris Agreement. I'm not going to go through a sort of textual analysis of what came out of it. The question that does have to be answered is, will it deliver global net zero? And of course, the answer is no, that it was never going to do that. And in fact, COPs are never going to do that. Conferences at the moment are where countries come together to discuss the issue. They don't cut emissions per se, because that is still very much in the ballpark of individual nation states as to what they do, because the commitments that are made either at a COP or in the run-up to a COP are voluntary. There's no centralized framework saying this is what you must do. I mean, that was tried before. It was the framework for the climate talks running up to Copenhagen, where it finally ran into the sand. And so the different framework, which actually is starting to move somewhere, is where countries come with essentially what are your commitments, what are you that they offer up, what they're prepared to do on climate change. And we have to hope everybody will join in enough to make it work. But one of the things that was obvious at this COP, when you're in the room, is just how much there are power politics at play. There was an intervention quite late on, as many of you may know, between India and China to water down some of the phraseology about coal phase out. But in other parts of it, there were interventions by Saudi. There were things going on with the US as well. And of course, this matters because these are the big emitters, and the UK can do some important things. I'll come on to that later, but globally, we're not going to get to zero emissions without these people playing ball. So that aspect about it being voluntary and then bringing what they can to the table when they are either heavily dependent on the use or the extraction of fossil fuels becomes a major sticking point. Here's what I naughtily snapped as I went forward to see what was going on. In the centre there is John Kerry, the negotiator for the US. Franz Timmermans is slightly hidden on the right. There's Gabon, who was representing G77. And this held up the entire event for something like an hour and a half while this haggling was going on in the room about what the final text would say. So there is some pretty brutal power politics going on, and you can see why if for somebody like Saudi or for somebody like US with their heavy dependence, this is a zero emissions target is quite threatening. And so part of the deal in trying to get globally to net zero, and where the UK can play a role, is about making sure there is integrity in the process. And we have some accounting loopholes, I would say, with what was adopted at COP26 that will need a hell of a lot of attention if they're not going to be ways of looking good without actually being good, in particular the carbon markets as they opened up for offsets. Anyway, let me move on, because the other thing that was abundantly clear, and it's always been clear, but it really hits you in the face when you're in the room with developing countries who are being horribly hit by what we've already got. And Julia mentioned what we've seen in terms of climate extremes that have driven problems all around the world. We've still got a kind of ongoing crisis in British Columbia and Canada at the moment with the flooding there, unquestionably now pretty much linked to climate change. But the developing countries are already experiencing that, which is why solidarity with developing nations is absolutely critical to delivering net zero globally. And the UK can actually have a role here, and a very important role internationally, because, as I say, if we don't get the solidarity right, and we don't get developing countries coming to join in, I don't want to say it doesn't matter what we actually do in the UK, because that's not true. But we are around 1% of emissions, and we need everybody to join in, and including those nations which are developing quite rapidly and potentially going to need more energy. So we need to, in the UK, reverse the international aid cut, because climate finance, which was a big talking point at the COP, is meant to be additional to international aid, not a replacement for it. And we've got this question about loss and damage. Just to fill that out a little bit, loss and damage is where those countries are already experiencing impacts of climate change. So this is from the Marshall Islands. It was about 2 years ago, but they were experiencing flooding, which they've never experienced before, through rising sea levels. And for the people in the Marshall Islands who have done nothing to cause this problem, but are now being hit by it when the problem arose from what developing countries did over decades and centuries, you can see the sense of injustice there would be extremely powerful. And it's not just there; it's in obviously other Pacific islands like Tuvalu, Vanuatu, but it's true in Bangladesh. It's true in Pakistan, experiencing heat waves unlike they've ever seen before. And the people there thinking, well, hang on, we've got this problem now, this massive problem, which is our climate is changing and making our lives unlivable. And we didn't cause it. It was nothing to do with us. So that's why the solidarity piece with developing countries experiencing these changes is not only a matter of morality and justice, it's also a matter of pragmatically essential to deliver the mitigation on emissions that we're going to need. And the UK can deliver leadership on mitigation as well as that solidarity package. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. As Julia covered it, as I thought, extremely well, as I expected rather. But what can we do as to provide international leadership on mitigation so it goes beyond our, if you like, our 1% of global emissions? Well, one thing we can do, and we are doing actually, is be an exemplar on process. How do we go about what we do? We have a Climate Change Act, we have statutory advisors like the Climate Change Committee, we have reporting. So there's some good stuff in place. There are further questions that I would have about what are known as consumption emissions, in other words, not just happening within the UK's borders, but the if you like, the global footprint of the UK. And that's quite considerable and goes some way beyond what is actually appears in our accounts. We'll also need to be an exemplar on fairness. I'll say a little bit more about that later. We can provide leadership through both delivery of new technology and coalitions of the willing. That was a feature of COP, that the UK was quite correctly trying to assemble coalitions of the willing on things like electric vehicles, on coal finance, and indeed on deforestation. And opinions will vary about how effective those coalitions look and how wide they are and how deep they are. But at least I think it was the right strategy to try and provide those coalitions of the willing who will go beyond what is in the formal COP text. We don't all have to go at the speed of Saudi Arabia. We can assemble groupings where they go faster, and the UK can play an important role on that. It can play an important role on development of technology. We've done extremely well on offshore wind, as most people will be aware, and that technology is now something that is being rolled out in all sorts of places. And I get emails about what's going on in Vietnam, in China, in Taiwan, and the east coast of the US, and more. So that's a technology that we've helped develop and, if you like, made available to the world. And the other thing, the way we need to do international leadership, is on the delivery of our targets. Our targets are actually quite strong. They could be stronger, but they are, compared to international comparators, they're quite strong. So the thing that we've committed to internationally under the what's known as the UK NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution, 68% by 2030. That compares to a cut so far around 42%. So we're almost going to have to cut again by half from our pre-pandemic emissions by somewhere in the sort of early 2030s. So yeah, we've got some stretching targets. Again, I emphasize, if one were to take on the full nature of the climate crisis, you would say they actually need to be stronger. But they are challenging enough as they are. And this has to happen quickly. That's another thing that I would like to emphasize here. They have to happen quickly. because if you take the midpoint of our 6th carbon budget, that's about 13 years away or a bit more. It's not long. And sorry, I thought there was something, another piece there, but what that means is that most of the emissions cuts that we're going to deliver to get most of the way to zero emissions are going to have to be delivered largely by technologies that we already know exist and that we already have started to deploy. Innovation's great, and I certainly wouldn't want to discourage innovation in all sorts of areas, like, you know, industrial processes, and some of the waste management will need some innovation in various places as to how we go about it. But if you look at the what our 2019 emissions look like, you can see that the big stuff is transport, power, residential, and business. And so we are going to have to take major chunks out of all of those in the next 8 years, and further chunks in the next 13 years. So there isn't going to be some magic technology that comes along and helps us out with all that. It's mostly going to be stuff that we already know how to do. Which is why I say most emissions cuts will come from existing technology, which is ready for scaling up. And I can't emphasize enough how much the next decade is going to be critical on whether we keep climate to some kind of reasonable level of temperature rise. It's going to be determined over the next decade much more than it is by kind of 2050 targets or 2060 or 2070 targets. It's got to be delivered. A lot of it's got to be delivered in the next decade or so. So what does that mean for what we do to deliver net zero in the UK, focusing on that immediate need? Well, the strategy, as actually outlined by the Climate Change Committee in 2008, but since taken up by others like Energy Transition Commission, International Grouping, is to electrify everything. Electrify wherever you can, because electricity can be made zero carbon. It's difficult to make an internal combustion engine car zero carbon, not impossible, but difficult and probably quite inefficient. As Julia said, electric cars are 4 times more efficient than petrol and diesel cars. So zero carbon energy is going to be precious, and we need to use it well. So all these things need to be rolled out at speed and scale. And people back at Greenpeace get quite bored of me saying this: speed, scale, speed, scale, speed, scale. Those are the things that we need. So what are my big 5 in energy? I should say I'm not looking at talking about land use here, because there's all sorts of interesting and challenging stuff around diets and land use and rewilding and nature restoration and so on, which I'm not going to touch. But these are the ones for energy, which I thought you'd probably be most interested in. I call them the big 5. So first of all, we need a big rollout of renewables, especially offshore wind. Offshore wind is going to be the backbone of the power system in the 2030s and 2040s. And there may be some other, there's an important role for solar rollout, onshore wind as well. You may think nuclear is a good idea. I don't, but nuclear is going to be a big part of it, plays much of a part at all. The backbone of all this stuff is going to be offshore wind. We have a target of 40 gigawatts by 2030. We need to keep rolling on at the sort of pace that we need to deliver that, and keep rolling on right through the 2030s and into the 2040s. It's the 2030 for the 40 gigawatt target in offshore wind is not an endpoint, it's the platform for going further. We need to smarten and extend the grid and add storage. So there's going to be a lot of variable renewables on the grid. We need to have a grid that is capable of managing that well. Storage is a part of that. Demand side response is a part of that, so that we use electricity when it's available, where it's possible to shift demand even by a few hours. That will help a lot. Interconnection is what I mean by extend the grid. If we interconnect with our European neighbours, then it becomes much easier to manage that high volume of variable renewables. And of course, we will need quite a lot of storage. There will still be, even if we extend the grid over large regions, there will still be periods of very low wind, and there will be periods of very high wind, and we will need to include storage in that. I was pleased to see this morning that there is funding for a green hydrogen project at Whiteley Wind Farm in about half an hour south of Glasgow. That's very welcome. I think we'll need to do quite a lot more of that. Obviously, batteries play a role, but they're not going to deal with those long duration, all those periods when there isn't much wind across the UK. Also, part of this is that our wind resources need to be spread. At the moment, with very heavy concentration in Scotland and the North Sea. I think it's very helpful to have floating wind going into the Celtic Sea, which appears to be the next plan as we come up to the next renewables auction, because that spreads, it makes the load management on the grid that much easier. So that's my number 2. Electrify vehicle transport, we're doing that reasonably well. Again, an announcement this morning about new homes having electric chargers. That won't bail us out, but it will be very helpful, because then more and more homes will automatically have a vehicle charging point. The big challenge, of course, is going to be retrofit. Fortunately, the global car industry is now sort of steadily turning the supertanker towards electrification. So it feels like that's all going in the right direction. And there was also a welcome announcement about HGVs during COP, where the UK has said all new HGVs, including the 44-ton articulated types, are going to have to be zero emission at tailpipe by 2040. So we're making progress there. That's good. Where we're not so much making progress is efficiency in all buildings. That's residential and commercial. And efficiency also includes product standards, by the way, whether it's your phone or photocopiers or laptops. Zero carbon energy is going to be precious stuff, and we don't want to go around wasting it. We need a bit more coming from the efficiency in the well, we were a bit disappointed, frankly, at the absence of any kind of building efficiency strategy, money for building efficiency in the owner-occupier sector, which of course is a big sector in the UK, and we do need that quite badly. We also need to be doing rather better on rollout of heat pumps in residential and commercial build. Again, heat pumps are the things that use that zero carbon energy from renewables. So yeah, those are, so that's my big 5. The reason I mention those is that they do not provide all the answers. And I emphasize, there's plenty of other stuff that needs to go alongside it. We need action on waste, on HFCs and F-gases. We'll need action on innovation. We need a more circular economy. And I've completely left out, because it's interesting but complicated, the whole land use stuff. But in terms of delivering our targets, if we don't get this 5 right, we're not going to do it. And so time, energy, money, both political and technical, needs to be spent on these. Otherwise, we're not going to get where we need to get to. And so I'll finish. I've just said all that. It's going to be very difficult to get there without those 5. And just to say that as someone enmeshed in the civil society movement to deliver on climate ambition, I think we will see a shift in emphasis away from government setting targets. The government's got plenty of targets now, we will see a shift to a focus on delivery. What are you doing? How far are you going? How fast are you going? Are you doing enough? Rather than saying you need to say how many heat pumps are going to be installed by 2025. So the focus will shift to delivery. It might be slow, but it will. And there will be inevitably a focus on fairness, both fairness internationally, which I mentioned earlier on, about developing nations suffering the impacts of climate change, but also fairness in terms of how these policies are delivered. Because fairness comes up whenever there's any check-in with the population at large. It comes through in climate assemblies, both the national one and the numerous local ones. If these policies are not seen to be implemented fairly and help given to those who can least afford it to make the transition, then they will run into trouble one way or another. So if the focus is on delivery, then fairness needs to be a central part of what is done. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
Fantastic, though. That was really, really interesting. I mean, I think from both speakers, it really gives us some great insights, setting up the challenge. What are we really going to do to mitigate, and the importance of adapting? And I think very interesting, the kind of adaptation and what that signpost is to say, it's a real problem, we've got to deal with this. So the technologies, and then going into the politics. So going into the Q&A, I'm first going to introduce the rest of the panel with our fellow Foundation Future Leaders. So Delphine, maybe we'll go to you first. So we've got Dr. Delphine Byford, who's working in defence equipment and support for the Ministry of Defence, and also one of the other Foundation Future Leaders. I think, Delphine, you had a few words you might want to say.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Delphine Byford. So I currently work as an environmental consultant in the Ministry of Defence, and my background is marine science. I worked at the Ghent University in Belgium, looking at the effects of offshore wind farms on the seabed. I think it's going to be a very big challenge to reach net zero. It took the oil industry about 50, 60 years to become dominant, and we're now talking 29 years to get various industries to that same level. And like Baroness Brown said, the technologies that will be used, heat pumps, electric vehicles industry, they're going to more than double the electricity demand. And the only way we're going to get there is by accelerating deployment of climate solutions. Like Doug Parr said, we need to act fast, but also supporting development of new solutions and tackling every sector of the economy, not just the easy ones. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. Even looking at my personal life, for example, I believe transport is going to be the biggest challenge. I was reading through the net zero strategy set out by government in October, and the sector has the highest percentage of carbon emission at 32%, but the expected reduction is only around 50% by 2035. So that's quite a big challenge. At work, I see it. So I'm mainly involved in the maritime sector, the Ministry of Defence, where we're looking at maritime shipping, how to deal with that and the challenges that come with that. But from a personal perspective, in September, I started walking to school, scooting to school with the kids. And it has been a real challenge because the infrastructure isn't there. I can't cycle with my son to school because there are no safe cycle lanes. I moved from Belgium 7 years ago, where I would be cycling everywhere without helmets, and here I can't. And I think that's going to be a big cultural change as well, and that might be quite a big challenge for the UK, more so than other countries. Again, I read in the net zero strategy that they have committed to spending £2 billion over the next 5 years, but I think, what they want is to halve the journeys in towns and cities for people to walk and cycle, but that's going to be a massive cultural change as well. So it's that behavioural change that Baroness Brown also mentioned. I think that's just a little bit from me. Thank you.
I think that actually nicely introduces to Balazs, who's head of delivery at DG Cities. So probably also gives us a first discussion point around, how our cities doing about that. Over to you, Balazs.
No, thanks very much. And thank you for kind of all the presentations before as well. So if I may add a kind of 1 or 2 points, I work quite a lot with the electrification of transport and also kind of some of the bits around homes as well. I do think that kind of the transport is moving kind of reasonably well, but there is a huge challenge with scaling up. Currently, the UK has about 1 or 1.5% of vehicles that are electric, and to get to 100%, it's going to require a massive scale up in terms of infrastructure and vehicles. But a lot of it is being done and actually is on a right trajectory. Kind of numbers of vehicles are increasing kind of exponentially, but there is still loads to do. In the homes part is where I also feel that there are kind of quite a number of challenges where not enough is being done because it's also kind of very difficult. And there is not an easy fix of, oh, you can just buy something different, which is electric. It's much more difficult to kind of retrofit homes to make them kind of zero emission, essentially. And I think this is sort of where kind of another challenge comes in, which is that we need to get to net zero on everything. So kind of making announcements and kind of doing kind of one thing and focusing on that is not enough, because if we cannot really do that, a certain year is only about electric vehicles, say, because we need to at the same time progress homes, we need to progress business electrification, we need to progress kind of reducing kind of the emissions from the energy grid. So it's more that I think we need to kind of keep measuring and seeing, okay, which one is the kind of best value for money thing that we can do to reduce carbon, and then track that, but then do all of these. And we work a lot with cities, and cities all have kind of councils around the UK have kind of net zero targets, by 2030 even. But kind of having the target is great, but then all the different departments, all the different kind of work streams kind of need to kind of align to that, and everybody needs to kind of deliver against it. The new thing, there are often kind of scale gaps. It's often difficult to know what kind of local authority should be doing, what national government should be doing. So I think kind of having a sort of easy templates and, okay, these are the bits that you can do, this is what everybody can do, this is the best investment you can make, kind of pound per CO2 reduction, and kind of this is what you need to do across all the sectors. This will be crucial. So again, kind of recent announcements, electric vehicles, great, it's going to be growing, but there was basically nothing on homes. Like UK should be installing like 300,000 heat pumps a year, and there is funding for 90,000 across X many years. Like, it's big numbers, but when you divide them up on how much actually things cost, it doesn't even get you anywhere near what we need to do. So I think it's important. It's sort of like, I almost would call it like the plastic straw syndrome. Like, we focused on it for ages, it felt like, and basically is a almost no solution to kind of a very small problem. We have huge problems, and we need kind of to focus on actually achieving those. Thanks.
Very good points there, guys. I guess there's two kind of first things. I think then if you have this first little part of the discussion around the cities, with the kind of first component on sort of transport and infrastructure related to that, and then a second part on homes. So maybe we'll start talking around transportation and the infrastructure related transportation, both on the cars, automotive, as well as Delphine was saying about how we're actually going to encourage people to ditch personal transportation methods for cars and into cycling around and things. So Julia, I know that you've done a lot of work in the transportation sector, so I'd be delighted if you would take that first.
Well, I think in a city like London, we are seeing a drop off in car ownership, which is a great thing. But of course, London is the only city in the UK with a decent public transport system, and we need that kind of investment in public transport. And actually, I think, personally think we need that move back to control of public transport by the local government. Because in Cambridge, for example, the only well-supplied transport routes are the ones that make a profit. And if you start to move out into Cambridgeshire and the people who need to travel to work in Cambridge, if you come from the Fens, there's pretty much no public transport to speak of at all. So, you know, we really have got to focus on getting decent public transport and having it so that it's not cheaper to drive your car as it is in Cambridgeshire than it is to get on the bus to get to work. So absolutely fundamental to demand reduction is brilliant public transport, and we're just so underinvested in that. And of course, you know, electric buses have proved to be very effective in many places, and it may be that for some longer distance journeys, hydrogen buses may turn out to be suitable. But we've got ways of decarbonising that. I think we also need to do more to see how we can move electric car ownership to lower income families, because I really do worry that people in low income families will almost become the pariahs of low carbon transport, because they'll be the people who are left with the beaten up Ford Fiesta or whatever it is that's still running on diesel, while all of the, you know, the middle classes have been able to get their ID3s or whatever it is there. And we need to make sure that, again, that inequality doesn't actually lead to people not being able to participate in the transition to net zero. So there's a brilliant scheme that if you're employed with a big employer, and typically it's only big employers who can do it, you can lease your car, your electric vehicle, out of your salary before tax and national insurance. So that dramatically reduces the cost of your of leasing an electric car. But of course, small employers, little local employers, are unlikely to be able to take on the risk of offering a scheme like that. So it seems to me we need a government scheme that enables everybody to lease an electric vehicle before tax and national insurance, rather than only those people who work for, you know, Pfizer or whatever it is, you know, the companies that can afford to be offering this to their employees. You know, the local farm needs to be able to have its employees take advantage of a scheme like that.
Seems like we're at that transition where the kind of day-to-day running cost versus the overall cost of electric being close to parity, but the upfront cost is still higher and the running cost is lower.
The running costs are so much lower. I mean, we have an electric car. You know, we used to pay pretty much, I don't know, 50 quid for filling the tank on our previous car. For £13, we can fill this one. It's just enormous difference, and it hasn't had to be. We've had it 2 years. It hasn't had to go in for a single service or anything.
The same thing then with the kind of in cities, the kind of regulation, which is also trying to drive this shift through kind of, you know, fees if you're driving an older car, which again is, you know, your running cost, which is high, but then the initial investment cost is also, you know, higher for electric. And so how we can get people across that transition is really important. Yeah, agreed. Doug, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. No, I mean, there's interesting points. I want to draw out another theme, which is that that to get local transport working well, and even local charging well, actually, when we talk about public charge points, but then also the heat agenda, because heat is intrinsically quite local, and particularly district heating networks. We need in the UK local authorities that are much more capable and competent right across the board. So not just the big sort of metro authorities, because London can look after themselves. They, you know, they're I just want to say something about that, but you know, if they were given, let's say, if they were given the powers, they could look after themselves because they have staff and resources that they can deploy on that. But this is something that needs to work right across the board with every local authority, and they are critical enablers of the entire piece. So I do think there is something that needs to happen there that is quite countercultural to the way the UK tends to do stuff, which is very centralized. and very much driven from the centre. And I think that local authorities are going to have to play a role. Most people who are experts in the energy efficiency side, for example, say that the sort of area by area, street by street stuff is the stuff that works best. Now, I don't see how you can do that without some kind of local planning going on. So I think the empowerment, both in terms of money and powers, needs to flow from the centre to the local in order to actually effectively deliver on this stuff, rather than the centralised schemes, which, you know, as we can see with the Green Homes Grant, can be fouled up. I'm not saying that, you know, all local schemes will inevitably work brilliantly, because they won't. But there is a difference in perspective when you come to the delivery compared to the high level policy settings.
Can I just say I couldn't agree more with you, Doug. I think the knowledge about the local population and local behaviour, and actually the trust between the local community and typically the local council, who's often the first place they look to for help with things, means that it's so much more effective to do these things locally.
I would definitely agree. Kind of the only place where I was smiling is that I feel that there is often still almost definitely the resource and often a skill gap even in London, and that's for electrification of vehicles, but also for homes, electrification of homes as well. And I feel that because the UK has, I think, about 300 or 400 local authorities which are managing that stuff like that, there is definitely a skill gap, and it's completely normal because people have been doing other things for the last 20-30 years in local authorities, and this is something new. It was never been a requirement to be kind of zero carbon ready or anything. So there might be a few who have been receiving innovation grants and hired some people who are able to kind of do and kind of roll out kind of pilot schemes. But there is a definite lack of people who can do that everywhere, and also for people who can be confident to scale. So pilots are usually quite easy, they're usually quite cheap. Providers are often happy to pay for it, or happy to install a few devices, two heat pumps or whatever. But if you would like to say, okay, now that we like it very much, now let's do it for 100,000 homes. Nobody has done that. And nobody has done that in London, and nobody has done that anywhere else.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of takes us into this kind of the issue of sort of homes and in the way that the housing stock in the UK, both kind of in terms of insulation, in terms of electrification, and also, as Julie was saying, around kind of also how adapted they are to heat as well. So the opposite problem, because we're going to insulate all these things to heck and then they overheat in the summer. So I mean, how do we address that challenge of just the wholesale change of old housing stock in the UK?
Well, I think the suggestion that homes should have a green building passport is an important one, because I think actually people find it quite daunting to be told that they're going to have all these things done to their homes, and if you spread that out over time, making sure that it takes a fabric first approach and highlight the opportunities when somebody's having a new kitchen put in or when something else is being done, to do these things incrementally, and then of course major opportunities when properties are sold before people move in and things. Then I think it looks more achievable, and people will feel more able to engage and respond to it, and actually start to see the benefits of doing some of these things. But I think we present it in a kind of shock horror. You're going to have all this stuff done at once. And people need to see there are incremental approaches to getting to the point. The heat pump is not the first thing you think about. It's the last thing you think about for most old homes, after you've done all of the other things you need to do in order to make a heat pump a cost-effective way of providing heat.
Yes, and kind of one of the things for that is that these home improvements can be, like, many of them actually don't in kind of first glance provide any benefits to you, like changing your heating to an air source heat pump or ground source heat pump. It doesn't do anything to your home. Like you have a net zero heating now, yes, but you know it's still warm. It was warm before, so that doesn't actually kind of massively improve anything. What you can do is you can kind of try and do home improve, like for instance loft installations or solar panels if they need to be installed. If you add it into kind of a loft extension project, or kind of start funding something like that, which people actually would like to do, that like, I would like to add some extra space to my loft, or I would like to, you know, build something else to the home. And, you know, as part of that, I can install an air source heat pump or a solar panel. That's something that where people can say, okay, I'm going to have more room, I'm going to have more space. And then I'm also kind of changing my energy system. So that's kind of immediately a better kind of proposal to people to make that change.
We're going to have to do something on the wake of going forward, kind of cladding replacement, also installing external heat pump, large-scale community things. It seems like a high-rise, large-scale heat pumps would be a good initiative to implement, but the retrofitting is going to be hugely expensive. I mean, I guess there's these kind of policies around, I think it was a California initiative where kind of almost the reverse charging, where who's going to pay for these kind of initiatives, these replacements, and whether you can kind of somehow roll that into electricity bills, kind of put forward the cost. So rather than the individual kind of spending something up front and then gradually getting a return on that, can we put that into the private sector? Would that be useful, or a way of kind of creating this capital to make these big investments, and then people have reduced energy bills? I think there was like an article where you can have this done by a company makes the investment and your energy bill just stays the same, but the company then is having that return in terms of the energy efficiency. I don't know if that's been considered. Doug, maybe to get, or you, or Doug.
Well, I'm certainly no specialist on this, but I think that was an approach that was taken in the early 2010s. I forget what the scheme was called now, but it was pioneered. And I think the trouble is, you know, you need to make sure there are very low rates of interest, but also the return on some of the retrofit measures that we're going to need because the UK's housing stock is so shonky. Things like solid wall insulation, it's very hard to see how you're going to get any kind of payback on that in a reasonable timescale, because the costs will be several £1,000s, and you know most people's energy bills. I mean, admittedly with high gas prices a bit more, but you know standardly your energy bills are 1,200, and at most you're going to knock off a couple of hundred, maybe 300-400 with solid wall insulation. So the you know the sort of financing through energy efficiency measures doesn't really stack up. It stacks up with some stuff. It stacks up with loft insulation. It stacks up with cavity wall. Stacks up with draft proofing, but the knotty stuff it doesn't.
Yeah,
no, absolutely, and that's what sort of we found as well, is when you do the numbers, you're not necessarily going to come up cheaper. Your electricity bills might not even decrease, and you put in loads of money to do something, and that's, you know, like nobody from their own pocket, like not many people from their own pockets would just do it to reduce.
We're going to add, you end up with inequality then again, and potentially, you know, I don't know if government schemes would come back. Looking at solar panels, for example, we looked at installing solar panels, and we wouldn't get the cost back after 15-20 years when we would have to install new ones because our roof is in the wrong direction. So without any schemes or anything, you really don't see the benefit. And yeah, I do think that you're then going to end up with inequalities as well.
I think we need to look at this on a kind of broader picture though, because I mean there is now developing evidence that that I think Bays have published, that the value of homes that are EPC C or better is increasing faster than homes which are less well insulated. We also need to be looking at the we need the mortgage and mortgage providers and the banks to be recognizing that mortgages on homes that are well insulated, zero carbon, low carbon, this is a lower risk investment for them than a home that is that is poorly insulated or like a high carbon home. And so they, we need to be seeing them offering really low interest rates on a better investment, reflecting their lower risk. And so we need a whole range of nudges for the consumers. If your house is going to be worth more, the asset is worth more. If your loans are cheaper, these are all part of the picture. It's not just the cost of the insulation itself. You're getting a return in various ways. We've got to illustrate that for people.
I think the game plan overall has to be to really try and ramp up the market, and it would be a market in the first instance for things that are attractive. So you start with the carrot, but ultimately it's going to have to be a stick. There's going to have to be a standard on homes, whether that's standard on homes coming to market or whether that's standard just for everything. I think maybe that needs to be phased, but I think everything that people have been saying is true, and I think there are ways of making some of this stuff attractive. But in the end, as Balazs says, it's not always going to be cost effective. So where is the impetus going to come from to make it happen? And you can find it from other ways, as Julia says about mortgages. But whenever we did a large piece on a large analysis on this in it goes back to the noughties now, but fundamentally things haven't changed. And in the end, it's very difficult to see how it's delivered without some politically rather contentious standards that need to be applied. And then, as Delphine says, you're straight into kind of low-income families who might be homeowners. And where do you sit with all that, and how is that going to be delivered? So there are some knotty policy issues around the delivery of this. There is no question where if you try and integrate fairness, I think you end up with quite hefty government intervention to make it happen.
Yeah. And you need government intervention anyway, because when you look at when you look out towards 2050, the kind of operating cost savings from the green economy start to balance out the additional investments. But that's overall, and the big area of saving is transport, because transport is so much more efficient. So there are huge savings in transport. And as you say, there are costs in buildings, in industry, and in other areas that are not balanced out. So actually the Treasury has to be there saying, how do we redistribute the savings from transport in order to support the change in other sectors? And that's what Treasury is there to do, to design effective tax systems. And I would caution very strongly against adding more costs to electricity, because at the moment electricity already has the costs of decarbonising our power system added to it, whereas gas gets away without a carbon price. So we're already giving the wrong signal to consumers about what to do. And actually we need to be taking costs off electricity to reflect actually that electricity will be getting cheaper, and encouraging people that they can use electricity and not perceive it as this terribly expensive way of heating your home or doing things.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one of how to tie in those investments that someone might make into the final property prices and final thought. But I guess I'm going to try and get through a few of the Q&As. There's some really good questions that have come up in the chat, and we've done some good things on the UK level. And one of the ones really that's come back a couple of times is the comments you made around how we can do this investment in net zero, and that's going to increase our GDP. And I think this really interesting point, which was kind of on these countries that are we trying to persuade to kind of be better engaged into the net zero mission. So there's things like the kind of hydrogen economy and how that might lead kind of Middle East, Saudi Arabia to make large investments in solar and generate hydrogen to replace the oil and gas systems. Like, is that something you think is on the agenda, or what else can we do to persuade others across the world to make the changes we are doing? So Julie, do you want to go first? If you're happy to.
Well, I mean, those countries are certainly thinking about that and have been installing solar, and I think we need to be encouraging them to make that transition. There is clearly a significant opportunity for them there.
You think the solar hydrogen is going to go because it seems to be, say, Germany, which is not made, or in how they're going to make an energy transition is going to be very hydrogen heavy and this kind of need for a hydrogen market across the globe?
I think it's worth sort of unpacking some of these, the question around GDP and targets. The first thing I'd say is there are some things that are particular to the UK. Our housing stock is particularly bad. It's going back to Victorian era, etc. That's a UK problem. Nobody else is going to sort that out for us. We have to sort that out. Solar, wind, electric cars, these are international things, international electric HGVs, actually. I mean, these things are international. There will be a big international market in those. And so long as one feels that that is the direction of travel, then that is not a burden. That is a competition to see who gets the jobs and the wealth. And we lost out on onshore wind. We are getting some value from offshore wind. It could be more. But we are getting some value there, and we're looking to cash in on the electric vehicle side. But there will be stiff international competition for that. Now, I think the point more broadly about the economy is that, I mean, we've done a couple of pieces of work on that, and they very much bear out what Julia's been saying, that the transition to electric vehicles boosts GDP, right? I mean, on any plausible route to on kind of costs and take up, the fact is that you stop importing oil, and that's good for GDP because money recirculates within the economy. There is other work that we did with Cambridge Econometrics, which we released only about 2 months ago, that shows that the conversion to heat pumps and with energy efficient buildings also is a boost to GDP, even if the government gives no help, which I think is an implausible scenario. You will get higher GDP. So many of these things actually are not the drag on GDP. They are redistributive in the sense that if you convert from our current building stock to one that is efficient and using heat pumps, then jobs are lost in certain industries. Overall in the economy, jobs are gained, but jobs are lost in utilities. They are lost in the gas industry. And so I don't think there's that sort of problem issue around GDP and movement for the sort of things that we've been talking about is anything like the issue that it is in aggregate terms. It is an issue in terms of just transition, in terms of fairness to people who are being exposed to it. And that, I think, is the kind of crux of this matter. You can see it around oil and gas actually already, where the Scottish government has now pretty much said they don't see the Cambo oil field, the proposed Cambo oil field, as something that we should go forward with. And other parts of the political establishment, the Conservatives and Labour, a bit hedging, are saying, "Oh no, you're selling out workers in North East Scotland." And those are the kind of political and fairness dynamics that we need to be able to tackle.
Julia, Balazs, did you want to go on that one?
I just maybe on the GDP growth side, is that kind of how does it look kind of on the ground? Is that the UK is installing a lot of EV charging points, for instance, which is a new technology that is building new things. New things usually generates GDP, but then that know-how and that kind of skill set and that scale that they will gain here will allow them to go to other countries and do the same thing. So if other countries are kind of doing it slower or kind of not doing it, if this will be the direction of travel, and it's fairly difficult to see how it might not be, kind of electric transportation is definitely almost the direction of travel. There will be a possibility for kind of companies that grow out of the UK to work elsewhere and actually do the same sort of things. And other countries would be able to do kind of very much the same things. Kind of solar panels are, produced largely in China, and China is probably pretty happy with producing lots of solar panels and increasing their capacity of producing even more solar panels. So I think there I think it is an opportunity. Kind of the world is kind of going somewhere new, and people who are grabbing onto it will kind of be taken forward.
Yeah, I'd follow on to that, and from what Doug was saying in terms of, so then in terms of, say, UK innovation and UK Inc., what are the technologies that really want to champion as a country? Are we going to go down tidal? Are we going to go around nuclear or carbon capture storage, or into hydrogen? And is there a role, which technologies do we pick some winners, as well as implementing things that are already kind of known to work? But what should the UK Inc. or UK innovation be driving? Should ARIA be helping some particular initiatives? What do you think would be the ones the UK should double down on or look out for?
I read something quite interesting that you might know more about, Sandy, about ITER, International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor in France, that if it is successful, which is nuclear fusion, then by 2035, then we would reach net zero. If it's not, then it would be a lot harder to reach net zero. Now, I'm quite new to this part of it. You probably know more, but I don't know what parts of the UK, or how much of the UK has a part of it, and if that would be a substantial turning point, if it was.
Ambitious for net zero for 2050, but in terms of, ITER is like the main fusion reactor, international test reactor, which is going to be the next follow-on, which is demonstration test reactor, is scheduled for 2050. So it's too slow. But there is a huge innovation in the UK around fusion. So definitely we are one of the countries where other people want to come to find the fusion scientists and engineers that work here. So General Fusion, a Canadian startup, is relocating to the UK to gain into the expertise of the fusion sector in the UK. So I think the private enterprise might be able to iterate quicker. So there's some ideas for smaller reactors, that there's commitments for private enterprise to say power to grid by 2035. It's very ambitious. It's a new technology, but there will be a need in the kind of energy transition for some new technologies, and maybe fusion has a role to play.
I certainly can't see fusion playing a role much before 2050. I think, new technologies are a good thing. In general, we found that, the introduction of new technologies makes the transition cheaper. So we should encourage new technologies, but we shouldn't rely on them. We can do the transition with what we've got at the moment if we have to. New technologies will only make it easier, but there is no way anybody should be saying we won't get to net zero if we don't get this technology, because that's not the case. We can do it. I think the UK has some, we have some real assets in the hydrogen area. We have some very lively growing companies like ITM Power and Ceres Power and Intelligent Energy. And indeed, we have JCB producing their hydrogen diggers, and Wrightbus producing hydrogen buses. So I think we've got, if we continue to develop that, we have a chance. I think that we somewhat missed out at, as Doug indicated, on in wind. Really, we don't have any original equipment manufacture in wind, but we have a lot of support and technologies that enable and make offshore wind more efficient. And we've got, I think, a lot of opportunities in the digitalization and AI space, which can be applied to pretty much any of the low carbon technologies. And I think we also have some real opportunities if we invest in them in looking at low carbon agriculture and how we drive that forward, because that's going to be crucial to us and globally.
Yeah, very much endorse that. I mean, nuclear fusion is talking up its opportunities and chances, but then it's always been doing that since when I was in my 20s. So I'll believe that when I see it, not before. But in terms of spaces for innovation, I would say storage, actually, of which green hydrogen is an important part. There are some other interesting ideas around storage kicking around. Which, including liquid air, for example, that's already being deployed near Manchester, and has got, I think, a contract on the west coast of America. That's a UK-based company. So storage more generally around the grid, and smart grid, which is kind of data management, data manipulation, which we're already quite good at, and lots of countries are going to need as the renewables levels ramp up. So there's those two. I think I think the UK, if it wants to play a real role in this, needs to look at industry and industrial emissions and say, okay, where can we do something here that nobody else can? Maybe chemicals industry, which is strong. But there's nothing sitting on the shelf waiting to happen there. I think a lot of that is kind of things like heat pumps and so on, which we've already done elsewhere in buildings. But I think let's not just think about technology as where innovation lies. I think some of the most interesting innovation that's going on in the UK is potentially around policy and agricultural support. And if we can get that right and show how you can deliver a food system that is good to the climate and good for nature, I think that's a really big deal.
And I think we also need to be thinking of solutions that actually encourage resource efficiency. So, I mean, my example of that would be not a very helpful one here, but when Rolls-Royce moved from making profit out of selling spares to making profit out of selling power by the hour, you stop making turbine blades that last as short a time as possible that your customer will put up with, so that you can sell them some new ones and make some money, to thinking, oh, we need to design ones that last as long as possible. And we need more innovation in business models that support the circular economy, whilst enabling people to make money. So warmth as a service. So vehicle multiple ownership schemes, or indeed vehicle rental by the hour schemes. All of those things that enable us to take one asset and use it much more effectively and for longer, rather than everybody having their own and continually having a new one.
You'd hope the kind of financial expertise of the UK would allow us good mechanisms to achieve this. I'll try to then, maybe we'll just do a very quick question, which is then around how do we scrutinize government's actions, and also how as individuals, how do we empower government's actions?
Well, we get out and vote for a start, because not enough of us in this country vote. And in particular, we need to make sure young people and people who are concerned about climate issues get out and vote for people who commit to doing the right things.
I do think there's an existing apparatus of scrutiny around in Parliament through select committees and even sort of backbench debates. I think what I feel is missing is that doesn't get traction necessarily on government, and it's actually the kind of public uprising that does. If you look at the recent issue of I'm sure the water companies wouldn't like me putting it like this, but sewage dumping in rivers, which has been going on. And it was a sort of easy thing to mobilize around. If I'm looking at it as a campaigner, I think, well, you can see literally the shit pouring into the rivers, into your local river. That's a thing that people can quite legitimately get very upset about. And that drives the mobilization, and that drove a change quite hastily in the way the government thought about it. And like Julia said about young people, that's important. And that means sort of mobilizing people is kind of the day job for me and my colleagues. So we can see opportunities, but I think the challenge is that the shift from, as I outlined in my talk, the challenges shift from talking about targets, which are kind of big overarching visions, to talking about, how do we get this to happen? So you can see that with kind of Insulate Britain, for example. I mean, you don't have to sign off on their tactics to say that's the kind of shift that you can see. Those protesters were not saying net zero by 2030. They were saying get on with the job. And in terms of what they were actually calling for, it's pretty hard to fault it. It's pretty on the nail.
It needed to be insulate and ventilate Britain.
And shade. And shade.
Personally, what I think would really help is is a very clear kind of essentially measuring system. So on some of the charts that have been shown, you can see all the various kind of actions that you can need to take to get to net zero, and you have nice kind of bends there. So I think any action a government takes in net zero could be scrutinized against that. Could be say, okay, how much of that, if we are at 100 now, how much of a percentage reduction does this action actually cause? Is it a 0.5% or is it a 10%? And then if we are being sold things which are kind of portrayed as, oh, this is going to solve everything, and it's actually calculated to be like a 0.1% change, then okay, that's important as well. But let's put that much emphasis on it, and then let's put more on things which are actually creating more change. So yeah,
that's what the Climate Change Committee does, of course.
Yeah.
As do House of Commons and House of Lords select committees.
Yeah, and I think it's just a level of that, like people basically able to tracking it and checking it kind of very easily, very simplistically understood, so that everybody knows and everybody can kind of, even people who don't understand the science behind it potentially, or only kind of follow topics like this marginally kind of on the side of their lives, can actually kind of still see where things are.
If I could just add something, Sandy, it's also I saw a question pass about world's demand for copper and impacts on areas mined and how to ensure a just transition. It's also scrutinizing the global impact of things we do, social, economic and environmental. How are we ensuring that our electric vehicle, when it's being built, isn't that the emissions aren't larger from building a battery and from gathering those rare minerals. I think that's also, it's placing it in the bigger picture, not just the UK as well.
Yeah, there's lots of wonderful discussion, and I think so. I would use this as an occasion to highlight further discussion. There's another Foundation of Science and Technology event, COP26, where do we go from here, coming up on 1st of December. So certainly opportunity to carry on this discussion there. I'd also like to signpost the FSC Foundation Future Leaders Scheme is open for applicants for next year's scheme. So the aim of this scheme is to bring together a cohort of 30 mid-career professionals from academia, industry and policy, so as we have done over the last year. And I really hope that others will join us for our sessions tomorrow on people and culture in UK research and development, and as well as another session on innovating for change in a sustainable future. So thanks again to the panel, to the speakers and to the audience. It's been a really interesting event, so thank you.